Good morning, everyone. Welcoming you all to our Sunday CME. Today we have an excellent speaker, our ENT specialist, Dr. Mayush Ori, who is speaking on the topic an update on epistaxis. Going back to doctor's academic background, Doctor did the MBBS from Kasturba Medical College, Manipal, and MS ENT from the same college. Sir has over 21 years of surgical and medical expertise in ENT, out of which 16 years in Ahalya Hospital, Abu Dhabi, and 5 years in various government hospitals in New Delhi. Apart from performing microsurgeries of ear, he has his area of interest in reconstructive microsurgeries of middle ear and functional endoscopic sinus surgery. Welcome you, sir, for presenting the CME. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neema. Good morning, dear friends and colleagues. Happy Independence Day to all of you. Today, I'm going to speak to you about an update on epistaxis. Epistaxis is something that I'm sure each and every one of you would have come across in your clinical practice. So, before we start, we go to the introduction. Epistaxis is presented as a symptom, as a sign, and also a diagnosis. It is defined as an acute hemorrhage from the nostrils and the nasal cavity. Mild epistaxis is usually benign and self-limiting. In spite of that, it should never be treated as a harmless event. It could be the tip of an underlying iceberg. The ancient beliefs about epistaxis are quite interesting. Moving back to 1,800 years back old, Kahun Papyrus, an Egyptian gynecological text, 1800 years old, indicates epistaxis as a kind of magical indicator of fertility. If the woman's nose does bleed, she will get pregnant. If not, she will always be childless. That was the belief. Nosebleed was also a demonstration of extreme anger in the ancient Egyptian texts. Coming to the Greeks, according to the ancient Greeks, the menstrual bleeding and the nosebleeds were seen as virtually equivalent. A text called Aphorisms, supposedly by the Greek physician Hippocrates, links up a girl's first period and the likelihood of a nosebleed, declaring this to be a favorable sign of health in certain circumstances. He also declared that a nosebleed is a good thing if the menstrual period is suppressed, with the belief that if the blood couldn't get out the traditional way, it was equally valid if it traveled out through the nose. Now, coming back to the present, approximately 60% of the population of the world will be affected by epistaxis at some point in time, with 6% requiring professional medical attention. The majority of people would have had at least one nosebleed, usually as a result of trauma in the course of their lifetime. It has peaks of incidence at the age 2 to 10 and 50 to 80 years. Both the sexes are affected equally. To understand epistaxis, it's very necessary for us to understand the blood supply of the nasal septum. This is a very vascular part of the nasal septum. This is called the Little's area. It is at the anterior-inferior end of the nasal septum. And this is the area where there is a Kisselbach's plexus, which is a plexus of 5 vascular arteries. We have the branches from the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries. the sphenopalatine artery, which is the most important artery of epistaxis, greater palatine artery branches, and the superior labial artery septal branch. So all these 5 arteries meet anastomose at the anterior inferior part of the nasal septum, causing a rich plexus, which is the cause of most of the epistaxis. As I had already mentioned, the sphenopalatine artery. This is known as the artery of epistaxis. It supplies the majority of blood supply to the nose, particularly the posterior portion. Knowledge of the anatomical position of sphenopalatine artery is very important due to the need for possible ligation in case of a refractory posterior bleeding. It enters the nose through the sphenopalatine foramen at the posterior end of the middle turbinate. Now, this is the lateral wall of the nose, and this is the sphenopalatine foramen, from where the branches of the sphenopalatine arteries come out, and they go from posterior to anterior. So it's very important for us to know the surgical landmarks in case we need to cauterize or ligate the artery of epistaxis in severe cases. This is found in the posterior end of the middle turbinate onto the lateral wall. Common areas of epistaxis. This is where the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery systems meet. As I mentioned, Kisselbach's plexus, also known as the Little's area, which is located 1.5 centimeter behind the anterior mucocutaneous junction at the anterior inferior part of the nasal septum. It's also known as the 5 arteries area. Then there is a retrocolumnar vein, which is a thin vein traveling vertically downwards behind the columella. This is involved in mild or minimal intermittent epistaxis due to the dryness of the anterior part of the nose. And then something called the Woodruff's area at the posterior end of the inferior turbinate. So this is the area of posterior epistaxis. Also a very vascular area where the sphenopalatine artery anastomoses with the posterior pharyngeal branches. Coming now to the types of epistaxis. We have the anterior epistaxis and the posterior epistaxis. Anterior epistaxis is more common in younger population, usually due to the nasal mucosa dryness or trauma. May be alarming to the patient because one can see the blood readily, but generally less severe. Usually controlled with conservative measures or anterior nasal packing. As I mentioned, the area involved is Little's area, also known as the Kisselbach's plexus. Coming to the posterior type of epistaxis, which usually occurs in older population, hypotension is a common contributing factor here. There is a significant bleeding in the posterior pharynx, more challenging to control, may need anterior plus posterior packing here, and the area involved is the Woodruff's plexus, as already explained. Again, this is the cross-sectional area of the nasal cavity showing the anterior epistaxis and the posterior epistaxis. Coming to the etiology, we have the local causes. One of the most commonest, digital trauma to the nose, and then the facial fractures. Nasal sprays directed medially. This is a very common cause for epistaxis. Usually the patients direct the nasal steroid sprays, which they have to take over a long period of time towards the nasal septum, causing the dryness of the nasal septum and then further epistaxis. So in our clinical practice, we have to educate the patient how to use a nasal steroid spray. It has to be told to them to direct the spray, the nozzle of the spray, towards the lateral nasal wall in the direction of the tragus of the ear. So that's the proper direction of using the spray to shrink the inferior turbinates. Otherwise, a lot of these patients come to the OPD with epistaxis, and the reason is the improper use of the corticosteroid sprays. Then we have the inflammatory reactions like turbinates, hypertrophy, and polyps. Anatomic deformities like deviated nasal septum and nasal spurs and foreign body nose. Again, the local causes, we have intranasal tumors like hemangiomas, JNA, that is juvenile nasopharyngeal angiofibroma, a very vascular tumor seen in male teens. Chemical irritants, nasal prongs. A lot of patients post-COVID come to the OPD with epistaxis, and on history taking, we come to know that the patient has been on oxygen by nasal prongs for a long period of time. So history is very important to diagnose the cause. And if you know the cause, we can treat it well. Then we have local vascular malformations, changes in temperature and humidity. Systemic causes, hypertension. Studies have shown that there are multiple factors such as age and use of anticoagulation medication that may be the cause of epistaxis, and not the hypertension itself actually. Increased age induces fibrosis of tunica media of the arteries, which may lead to inadequate vasoconstriction after the rupture of a vessel. Then we have the blood dyscrasias. The most common inherited bleeding disorder associated with epistaxis are hemophilia A, hemophilia B, and von Willebrand's disease. Hemophilia A and B are caused by deficiencies in factor VIII and factor IX, respectively. Both are integral components in the coagulation cascade. Von Willebrand's disease is caused by a qualitative or quantitative deficiency in the von Willebrand's factor, a glycoprotein essential to the proper function of factor VIII. Inheritance of these disorders is sex-linked, and only males are affected. Alteration of clotting abilities, anticoagulation medications, or liver dysfunction with factor II deficiency. Congestive heart failure, arteriosclerosis, and collagen abnormalities can also be contributing factors to epistaxis. The ability to form clots is essential to the prevention and control of epistaxis. Both medication-induced clotting aberrations and liver dysfunction are common systemic factors influencing epistaxis. Chronic alcohol ingestion and renal dysfunction with associated uremia uniquely cause platelet dysfunction. Then we have the hematological malignancies, nasal allergies, drugs like aspirin, clopidogrel, NSAIDs, and warfarin. Pregnancy. Pregnancy is a condition of a hyperdynamic circulation, and there are many cases of epistaxis during the course of pregnancy due to this reason. Hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, Osler-Rendu-Weber disease, which is autosomally dominant inheritance pattern disease. Its presenting symptom of epistaxis is secondary to telangiectasias of the nasal mucosa. Now, a note on the common causes of epistaxis in children. Epistaxis is most commonly encountered in the pediatric population, secondary to digital trauma. Digital irritation of Kesselbach's plexus is a very common source of anterior septal nosebleeds in children, especially during the winter months with lack of humidification. The improper use of topical steroid sprays is another cause of epistaxis, as I've already mentioned. Repeated trauma to the epithelium of the septal mucosa from sprays directed medially can cause intermittent epistaxis. Trauma from a nasal foreign body can elicit epistaxis, usually giving a history of unilateral epistaxis. And then when we examine, we see there is a foreign body impacted. The use of nasal cannula can cause epistaxis secondary to the local irritation as well as drying effects of the nose. Septal deflections, bony spurs, fractures are underlying anatomical deformities of the nose that can predispose a patient to epistaxis. Any nasal obstruction leads to a disruption of airflow. The resultant turbulent flow anterior to this obstruction has a drying effect, increasing the opportunity for mucosal disruption and epistaxis. That is the mechanism of epistaxis in nasal obstructions. Furthermore, severe deflections or spurs can actually cause local trauma to the lateral nasal wall mucosa. That is in case of a severe deviated nasal septums which are impinging on the lateral nasal walls, and the same thing is with the spurs. Now coming to the management of epistaxis. The recurrent cases require at least CBC and coagulation studies. Any suspicion of malignancy of the nose or other abnormality should require referral to an ENT surgeon. A CT scan of the paranasal sinuses on all the three views, coronal view, axial view and sagittal view, will give us the complete picture of the underlying cause. Also, sometimes we need a supplementation with MRIs to rule out soft tissue tumors of the nose and the nasal cavity with paranasal sinuses. An angiogram may be needed in rare cases, and this is all aided by a diagnostic nasal endoscopy with nasopharyngoscopy. These are the investigations of choice. History taking is very important in cases of epistaxis. We have to ask for previous epistaxis, bleeding from the other parts of the body, nasal trauma, family history of bleeding, hypertension, hepatic diseases, use of anticoagulants or aspirin or topical nasal steroid sprays, other medical conditions like diabetes mellitus and CAD, etc. Now this is the picture of how the patient should be sitting on the chair while examining. Examine the patient in a calm and quiet area to decrease the anxiety, because a patient with epistaxis will have lots of anxiety. Ask the patient to sit upright, leaning slightly forward, and to squeeze the lower part of the nasal dorsum, not the bridge of the nose, which is a common mistake done by patients and even some of the doctors. So the correct area to squeeze is the lower part of the nasal dorsum, as shown in the picture, for 10 minutes to try to stop the bleeding. The patient should breathe through the mouth and spit out any blood or saliva into a bowl. Any backward head tilt will encourage blood to flow into the posterior pharynx and into the stomach, which will cause the patient to become nauseated and potentially vomit. And once the patient starts vomiting, because of the pressure exerted, the epistaxis will increase. So positioning of the patient is very important. Fresh blood is irritating to the stomach and will cause nausea and vomiting, which may further increase the patient anxiety. An ice pack on the bridge of the nose can be helpful. Ice to suck may also help through the palate. Monitor the patient's pulse and blood pressure. If the bleeding has stopped after this time, as it does in most of the cases, proceed to inspect the nose using a nasal speculum. Consider chemical cauterization if necessary. Observe for the signs of hypovolemia in severe epistaxis. Furthermore, gentle nasal irrigation with saline and placement of topical ointment in the nostrils creates a humidified nasal environment that can prevent further episodes of epistaxis. If the bleeding persists, a topical nasal decongestant for the purpose of vasoconstriction can be used. We are commonly using xylometazoline 0.1%, 1:1000 adrenaline solution, or even oxymetazoline. These are the three topical nasal decongestants and vasoconstrictors available. Care must be taken not to continue the topical decongestant use indefinitely, as the patient can become physiologically addictive. Some authors advocate placing ice pack on the nape of the neck with the belief that it produces a reflex vasoconstriction in the nasal mucosa. However, there is little research or evidence to support this. Now coming to A, B, C, D, E of epistaxis management. A, airway, the most important one. There is a risk of airway obstruction from the blood in the posterior pharynx or decreased level of consciousness due to the hypovolemia. The first thing is airway needs to be maintained. Airway has to be patent. Proper positioning to assist in managing the blood loss and frequent suctioning needs to be done. Be prepared to secure and place a definitive airway. Some patients in severe epistaxis may need an endotracheal intubation and then further management. This is to avoid aspiration, which can cause further complications. Then coming to breathing. Assess the depth of breathing and respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, very important parameters. Remember, a noisy airway is an occluded airway. Provide high flow oxygen. Coming to circulation, assess the heart rate and the blood pressure. In severe epistaxis, check hemoglobin, cross-match the blood, and on top of everything, start an IV fluid. Disability. Monitor the patient's level of consciousness. This helps to determine the severity of hemorrhage. Exposure. Keep the patient warm to prevent coagulopathy. If epistaxis is caused by a major trauma, always examine for the other injuries. Short note on vasoconstrictors in epistaxis management. Local anesthesia, lignocaine, should be used wherever possible to provide analgesia, especially during the examination. As I've already mentioned, xylometazoline, 1:1000 adrenaline, oxymetazoline are commonly used three vasoconstrictors. Then we have which are effective in anterior epistaxis. They aid in visualization of the bleeding site and assist if anterior nasal packing is required. Following successful application of topical vasoconstriction, patients should be encouraged to apply saline nasal gel or petroleum jelly, Vaseline, to the nose and the nasal cavity thrice weekly for a month. This has been shown to have a 94% success rate in avoiding recurrent epistaxis. Lidocaine is very important for examination of the nasal mucosa after controlling the initial bout of epistaxis, because the examination of the nose for epistaxis can be a painful process. So lidocaine is used in combination with these vasoconstrictors. Coming to chemical cauterization, we use three chemical agents: 75% silver nitrate, trichloroacetic acid 80%, and phenol 80%. Here we are using silver nitrate sticks, which are readily available. Chemical cautery of the visible blood vessels on the anterior part of the nasal septum is the most popular treatment method for idiopathic nosebleeds. Applying the vasoconstrictor before the examination may reduce the hemorrhage and help to locate the bleeding site. A topical local anesthetic reduces the pain of examination and also the nasal cauterization. Chemical cauterization is painful for the patient. It's mostly an OPD procedure and it causes burning of the nasal mucosa wherever we apply the cautery. So lidocaine acts as a painkiller here before we do the procedure. We apply a silver nitrate cautery stick for 10 seconds or so, working from the edge, moving radially towards the center. Never cauterize both the adjacent sides of the nasal septum in the same session to avoid a septal perforation. This is generally effective in anterior bleeds. However, there is a risk of a rebleed. Well, my general surgery colleagues must be very much aware of this infrared coagulator. It's a very old treatment for recurrent epistaxis, and this instrument is used for the treatment of hemorrhoids, while we use for the treatment of epistaxis. So the difference is this probe. This probe, we take the smaller size, and after giving a local anesthesia, we just coagulate by pressing this button here, and within two minutes, after 4 or 5 applications, the bleeding points are seen. It has got very promising results. Coming to oral and IV hemostatic drugs that we use, tranexamic acid is very useful, very effective drug. It can be used in a topical, oral, or injectable way. Tranexamic acid works as a potent competitive inhibitor of plasminogen activator and thus of the fibrinolytic system, and may therefore prevent clot disintegration and reduce the likelihood of rebleed. Etamisulate is an old hemostatic drug. Oral injectable routes are used. Etamisulate works by increasing the capillary endothelium resistance and by promoting platelet adhesion. I personally prefer tranexamic acid over etamisulate. Now this is a cross-sectional diagram showing how the anterior nasal packing has to be done. Anterior packing is required when the bleeding fails to stop with vasoconstrictors and local chemical cauterization. So now we start with by pinching the nose, putting ice on the bridge of the nose, ice cubes to suck. If the bleeding doesn't stop, then we apply local vasoconstrictors and chemical cauterization follows. If all this doesn't help, then we go to the next higher step of further intervention by anterior nasal packing. Anterior nasal packing can be a very painful procedure for the patient. It's usually an OPD or an ER procedure. We take bayonet forceps. Also, we have a Tilly's forceps by which we insert this roller gauze, which is impregnated with antibiotic cream, antibiotic ointment, or petroleum jelly, or liquid paraffin, and we insert this into the nasal cavity in an S fashion. You see here, this is the first one, and then we put the second, and then finally we fill up the nasal cavity in this way. This usually stops most of the cases of epistaxis. Coming to types of anterior nasal packs. Traditional Vaseline antibiotic gauze packing. Ribbon gauze soaked in petroleum jelly or antibiotic which is placed in the back of the nasal cavity as far back as possible and layered into the nares until it is completely packed, as I've already shown in the previous slide. Then we also used compressed sponge or tampons. The commonest use is Merusil, which is a dehydrated polyvinyl polymer sponge formed into flat tampons of various sizes. These are inserted into the nasal cavity and then they rehydrate. They are rehydrated by blood or saline, causing them to expand up to 3 times their original size, thus filling the nasal cavity and compressing the source of bleeding. Coming to the types of anterior nasal packs, we have anterior epistaxis balloons called rapid rhino, which consists of an outer layer of carboxycellulose that promotes platelet aggregation with an inflatable balloon that compresses the nasal cavity upon inflation, tamponading the bleeding site. And then we have absorbable materials. Various absorbable packing materials are available, including carboxymethylcellulose sponges, calcium alginate dressings, and wicks. These dressings can be left in place between 1 to 5 days. But remember, the longer the packing is left in situ, the greater is the risk of developing toxic shock syndrome. But we still use a small amount of these absorbable materials even in our post-operative cases. In most of the cases of functional endoscopic sinus surgeries, we leave behind some of these absorbable materials to soak the blood because this surgery has no sutures. We just open up the sinuses and leave them to drain by themselves. So we expect a lot of bleeding. So this is also used in most of our post-op cases in small amounts. And of course under antibiotic cover. This is a picture of the absorbable packs. So you see this is a Merusil pack, and when we insert this into the nasal cavity, it swells up by absorbing the mucus, and in cases of epistaxis, by absorbing the blood, it swells up to 3 times. Then we have something called rhino rocket, which we have this in our OPDs. This is used mainly for severe epistaxis. When the patient comes to ER or comes to the OPD, we cannot localize the bleeding point. The patient is bleeding, full of anxiety. So we have a plunger here and we just push this pack into the nasal cavity blindly. It just goes into the nasal cavity and it starts swelling up, causing a tamponade action. At least the bleeding comes down or stops till we can take the next step. So this is a very important, Rhino Rocket is a very important pack in cases of emergencies. Then there is this pack which with a nasal pack with an inflatable bulb, and this is similar to this pack, but this has got a guide wire, a thread, easy to pull it out and easy to locate it. Coming to the complications of anterior nasal packing, anosmia, pack falling out and continued bleeding, breathing difficulties and aspiration of clots, posterior migration of the pack causing airway obstruction and asphyxia if the packing is not done in a proper S-type fashion. The pack can fall into the nasopharynx, into the throat, causing a lot of discomfort to the patient, anxiety, vomiting, and then further epistaxis. Perforation of the nasal septum or pressure necrosis of the cartilage, and also sleep apnea. Now coming to the next higher stage of intervention, the post-nasal pack. Posterior nasal bleeds can be difficult to manage related to the relatively inaccessible site of bleeding and generally don't respond to the above mentioned standard medical treatment and packing. So here we use double balloon catheters which consist of a posterior and anterior balloon which are relatively easy to insert, although the cost may limit their use. Generally used in difficult posterior epistaxis. We have to avoid over-inflating the balloon catheters as this will cause increased discomfort, rupture of the balloon, or pressure necrosis of the nasal mucosa. Sometimes a Foley's catheter can be used 10-14 French with 30 ml balloon, which is a cheaper alternative to the double balloon catheters. Now this is the picture of post-nasal double bulb pack without inflation, and this is after inflating the bulb. And this is the cross-sectional picture inside the nose. As you see, the larger balloon is for the nasal cavity and the smaller one is for the posterior nasal cavity, and if you push it further down, this can also arrest the nasopharyngeal bleeds, which are practically almost impossible to visualize because of the location. Now, how to insert a posterior nasal pack? If you do not have double bulb balloons, we simply take a red rubber catheter, place it into the lower part of the nasal cavity, push it down so that we can see this other end coming into the oropharynx and the oral cavity. Tell the patient to open the mouth and pull the other end out, and here we can attach a post-nasal pack which we can make it ourselves with gauze piece, and we have to attach it very tightly to the other end of the catheter, and then push the pack through the mouth with your finger as far as possible into the posterior end of the oral cavity, into the oropharynx, and finally At the same time, pull the nasal end, and then finally this is the picture. This pack reaches the posterior part of the nasal cavity and the nasopharynx, and we tie the other end here to the anterior part of the nasal cavity. We make a knot here, and then we can put a plaster there. So this way we can also arrest a post-nasal or a nasopharyngeal bleed. Complications of posterior pack. Necrosis of the nasal ala. As you can see here, there's a necrosis here. Placing a pack in the nasopharynx can trigger the nasopulmonary reflex, resulting in apnea and dysarrhythmias. Therefore, the patient should be monitored in an intensive care unit or with continuous pulse oximetry. Remember, every patient with a post-nasal pack has to be kept in an ICU. Then, coming to electrocautery in epistaxis, we use monopolar or bipolar cauterization after applying 2% lidocaine block. Of course, all this is done under general anesthesia now. The cautery probe is used by catching the bleeding blood vessels, and then we cauterize the blood vessels under endoscopic guidance. Topical antibiotics and or petroleum jelly can be used post-operatively to avoid the drying effect causing a rebleed. Now coming to the surgical management of epistaxis. These are the 5 modalities. We have the arterial embolization, anterior ethmoidal artery ligation, sphenopalatine artery ligation, internal maxillary artery ligation, and finally, on top of all, external carotid artery ligation. Coming to the arterial embolization. Arterial embolization is performed by interventional radiologists, and it's a relatively new technique used to embolize the distal branches of internal maxillary artery. Under local anesthesia, diagnostic angiograms are performed to assess the vascular anatomy. Brisk bleeds will show up as blushes and can be selectively embolized. Microcatheters are used for embolization of selective vessels by gel foam. Nowadays, they also use cyanoacrylate glues, and the potential complications include transient hemiparesis, facial paralysis, blindness, columnar necrosis, stroke, and even death. Now coming to the transantral internal maxillary ligation. This is performed via Calvert-Luck approach, that is by lifting the lip, we go inside and reach the posterior wall of the maxillary sinus, which is fractured and flaked off to expose the pterygopalatine fossa. The tortuous internal maxillary artery is identified and ligated. It's a very extensive procedure with a high failure rate of 11 to 20%, high complication rate of 14 to 20%. The complications include facial paresthesia, facial pain, dental pain, numbness which stays for months together, hematoma, facial hematoma, ophthalmoplegia. It can also go to blindness. Endoscopic ligation of sphenopalatine artery, it's a very selective procedure with less comorbidities, less complications, relatively easier to perform than the other artery ligations. Nasal cavity is decongested, and 2% lidocaine with adrenaline is injected into the mucosa of the lateral nasal wall adjacent to the posterior aspect of the middle turbinate. A small vertical incision is created 1 centimeter anterior to the posterior aspect of the middle turbinate. That's where the sphenopalatine artery comes out inside the nasal cavity through the sphenopalatine foramen. A mucoperiosteal flap is elevated and the sphenopalatine artery is identified. This is all done under endoscopic guidance. Vascular clip or bipolar cautery is applied to the sphenopalatine artery. It's a very selective procedure as procedure of choice and we are going and hitting the target, the artery of epistaxis with less of comorbidities and the least complications. Then we have the other alternative, anterior or posterior ethmoidal artery ligation. This can be done by an external approach. An incision is made in this area. This is called the Lynch incision. It's a very old method to access the ethmoidal arteries. Nowadays it's done endoscopically. Anterior ethmoidal artery is located 24 millimeter from the anterior lacrimal crest, and posterior ethmoidal artery is located 36 millimeter from the anterior lacrimal crest. So these are the landmarks of these arteries. Very vascular arteries. So we have to be very careful when we go to locate them. The complications of the procedure include stroke, blindness, ophthalmoplegia, epiphora. Usually these are the complications of external approach. Again, the endoscopic approach, we do not have all these complications. But some doctors still prefer to go by external approach because they get a wider area, they get more exposure. But everything comes with a pinch of salt. You have more exposure, you open up more, you end up in more complications. And then finally, the highest level of epistaxis management is the external carotid artery ligation. We have two approaches here. Retromandibular approach, when the epistaxis is from the internal maxillary artery or its branches here, and the second one is the carotid triangle approach. Coming to the complications of external artery ligation, there could be a damage to vital structures of the neck, retrograde thrombus formation, persistence of bleeding due to collaterals, inferior alveolar nerve damage, infection of the infratemporal space, and death. But mortality is still rare. It is usually associated with hypovolemia secondary to severe bleeding or in patients with comorbidities. Knowledge of the vascular anatomy is critical to determining the location of the bleed. Once the location is identified, appropriate medical, conservative or surgical therapy can ensue. Now a note on the preventive measures of epistaxis. Keep allergic rhinitis under control. Use saline nasal sprays frequently to cleanse and moisturize the nose. Forceful blowing of nose should be avoided under all circumstances. Avoid digital manipulation of the nose with fingers or objects. Use saline-based gel intranasally for mucosal dryness. Consider using a humidifier in the bedroom in mild recurrent epistaxis. Keep nasal vasoconstrictor spray at home to use during mild recurrent epistaxis. Medico-legal pitfalls. Nasal packing can lead to serious infection called toxic shock syndrome. This we have to understand. Consider nasal packing as foreign body in the nose. So after the nasal packing, prophylactic broad spectrum antibiotics are recommended. Posterior nasal packing places the patient at risk of hypoxia and hypoventilation. Thus, the monitoring in ICU is recommended. And remember, a recurrent unilateral epistaxis should prompt further investigation to rule out a neoplasm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mayush, for an excellent, clear, and very neat presentation explaining in detail all the recent advances in the management of epistaxis. Now, the topic is open for discussion.
Thank you.
We have our ENT surgeons, Dr. Satyashankar. Sir, can you please add few points to the discussion?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Dr. Mahesh has covered a great deal of information in this topic, and he's covered almost all the aspects of the epistaxis. And of course, epistaxis is one of the commonest emergency in the ENT. We, of course, individual, every doctor has got his own way of management, but most of the time, which is coming to us mild to moderate, we are able to control in the Ahalya hospital, sometimes requiring admission and further management. But causes are variable. Sometimes we encounter quite a lot of idiopathic epistaxis also. Even after investigation, we are unable to find out the exact cause. But the management is almost same. We manage with the things which Dr. Mahesh has explained. We have most of the things in our facility. We get a call in the middle of the night or early morning, epistaxis, whether from the local causes or the systemic causes. And of course, systemic causes may require some internal medicine reference also because of the hypertension. And we get almost different types of epistaxis covering from the pediatric to geriatric. And Dr. Mahesh did a good job, and epistaxis as a CME is very rare, and he explained to the core, and even the general practitioners or the specialists, it is quite helpful. His way of management is quite good in the sense you're able to control the most of the epistaxis in his clinic in a very good way. I think this topic is very important to all of us, and I thank him also. And of course, we have certain limitation, especially encountering the arterial ligation. We don't have such experience in those fields. But nowadays, external artery ligation or internaxillary artery ligation is quite rare, because most of the time the trivial bleeding can be controlled with sphenopalatine ligation or cauterization, which can be done under general anesthesia. And simple bleeding from the anterior epistaxis, normally we encounter in the outpatient in adults. We manage in the clinic with the silver-nitrate cautery or antinasal packing in a good way. And of course, it is this subject is the matter of research, because so many things are developing over the time. We manage in a very simple way, starting from the antinasal packing, decongestants, and patient care, and all these things. And some cases may require surgery like septal correction or the cauterization under general anesthesia. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Satya. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satya. Any more questions from the audience? Krishnan sir. So if no more questions, we can conclude the session. So thank you, Dr. Mayush, once again for an excellent presentation. The posters as well as evaluation are posted in the chat box as well as in AHH WhatsApp group. Please fill up the forms before concluding the session, and see you all for the next Sunday CME. Thank you.
Thank you very much.